In this video, we're going to talk about employee manuals. It may not sound that exciting, but they can make such a difference to small employers in a short space of time, and larger ones, although those may be edits rather than starting from scratch. So, what goes into an employee manual? That's just one of the questions we're going to answer today, starting right now. Hi there, I'm Andrea Adams. I'm the host of HR Shop Talk. On this show, you get some expert insight into HR. I encourage you to subscribe to the show by clicking on the button at the bottom of the screen to continue learning from my smart and experienced guests. Today, I'm talking to Beverly Somers. Bev has spent 20 years providing human resource management solutions and now assists clients in various industries, performing human resource consulting and helping clients tackle the HR challenges they fear the most. HR 911 to the rescue. So hi, Bev, how are you?
Hi, I'm great. Thanks, Andrea.
All right. I am actually really looking forward to this conversation. Like I said in the intro, sometimes it sounds dull, but it's important. It makes such a difference. So why are employee manuals important?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's the creating consistency. So it's the consistency, but it's also creating guidelines, some expectations that builds trust with your employees, right? There's nothing worse than an employee. And I'll use bereavement leave as an example, right? If in that moment of, high emotion, you treat employees differently, that could totally demotivate an employee very quickly.
So I know you're a consultant to small business. Mm-hmm. So in your experience working with them, what difference do employee manuals make? What of their goals are you addressing when you create a manual?
So small organizations, they don't have the expertise, number one, right? So that's why I end up working with them. They don't have the expertise. So they don't really know what goes into a manual, what's a good manual, what's a bad manual. And so they don't have those HR guidelines. So first and foremost, it's to, help educate the business in, helping them create those general HR guidelines and policies. And then I think beyond that, we talked about the fairness and trust piece. Well, small organizations, it's not easy. Their business is servicing their customers or, making those products or whatever. And so that's their business. They don't have time to be spending on all this other stuff. So it really is that it creates that go-to, that easy to understand the policies and procedures. And then it's a training, it's not necessarily just the business owner that's going to be the one guiding this HR process. In a small organization, everybody needs to take a part of it. So then it kind of creates that guide. That as a business owner, all of your leaders are using the same baseline. Again, I'll use that. And so then thinking about the recruitment piece, if you're, an organization, you want to build trust and you want to retain your employees. It is a retention tool. There's nothing going to demotivate somebody more quickly, as I mentioned in the example of the bereavement. And if that's a good employee and that's one situation that turns them sour and they decide to leave the organization, well, then you're in a whole other HR mess, right? So I'm not saying that a policy manual is going to absolutely, retain your employees, but it certainly helps. And so then if you're retaining your employees, you can focus your time on your business and on your customers and so on. So
right. Here's the question about what typically goes into an employee manual. There we go.
So a full employee manual, it's an opportunity to educate the employee on your history, as I mentioned. It's also kind of the first jump into creating that feel, right? What's the culture like? Manuals are boring. They're not fun, but you can still have fun with it, right? So, you can add pictures. Today, a lot of companies are going with, videos, and they're going with a culture code. So I'll explain that in a second, but your HR manual definitely needs to have the details of your organization and cover all the policies that, you have within the scope of your organization. And it also needs to talk about what happens when you don't follow the policy. So understanding what the consequences are. And then there needs to be an employee acknowledgement in there so that employees on at least an annual basis should be signing as having read and understood this. So from a legal perspective, that's, if ever you're in a situation, that certainly will help mitigate your, potential risks.
So code of conduct kind of stuff would
So
go
yes,
into the manual?
exactly. That's where you can put some of your harassment, excuse me, and workplace violence. And you can even throw into the manual your policies, if you will, around, employee well-being and mental health. And we talked about that, the respect in the workplace, diversity, inclusion. So really it's, you can make it as big as you want, but it's a really good opportunity to put all that in play at the beginning. That's setting the stage. And then you get the nitty gritty of, what does vacation look like? What does sick time look like? What do breaks look like? Holidays. Yeah, the list kind of it goes on and on.
Yes. Okay.
So I kind of started on the culture code, and you talked about what goes into the manual. So if you Google some of the larger organizations like Google, Netflix, and in the background, they would have this boring employee manual, I'm sure, to help guide the organization on their HR policies. But they also have this culture code where it's often a slide deck, so it's often a presentation, but it encompasses some of the more important policies. They might inject some videos, welcome messages. So instead of that written format, they're creating almost a more visual, more interactive, engaging product that then they can share with employees. And then they share the highlights, right? Some of the more important policies and the ones that they really want to point out to employees.
If you found this interesting, subscribe to see all the episodes and comment. Is there something you've put into employee manuals that Bev hasn't talked about? Let us know in the comment section below. And back to you, Bev. So when you have a new client and you're writing an employee manual, how do you go about doing it? And if this is going to be a document for the business, they need to be included, do they not? So how do you do that?
A client usually comes to me because it's a specific ask, right? Whether it's an employee manual and so we still do the audit just to see, is there something else we need to uncover? So we go through that. Usually they have something. So I ask them to give me whatever they have. I'd obviously go through it with the business owner or the gatekeeper or whoever is responsible for this. So ideally, they would include the employees as well. And so it's getting their input, about, and sometimes it's not even that you're going to, put everything that they might suggest needs to be in there, but it's just the simple fact that you're asking employees for their input. The process of giving it to a client, and then we sit down, and it usually takes a good couple of hours to go through it together, and especially if they don't have a policy on something. Sometimes we go back and forth, and if they have to go back to a board to get approval on something in particular, to say, okay, we didn't have a vacation policy before or a sick time policy, but now we're going to put one in place. They have to get approval. So it can be a lengthy process, but it's certainly a valuable one that's worth going through. The return on investment is good.
Okay. So when writing an employee manual, you were going to err in favor of technical accuracy versus just being readable, digestible, which way would you go and why?
Yeah, so this goes back to what I mentioned about the culture code, this slide deck. So, your manual it's written for, thinking about the what if we get into a difficult situation, does this protect us, right? So it's a very legal document, which, like we said, is very boring for employees. So you need both. You need the technical side of it, but then I encourage companies to say, okay, how can we turn this into a more engaging and fun way to learn? And that's important too, right? Instead of just handing people, here's this 50-page document, read it and get back to me, sign it.
That's going to happen.
Right. How are we going to engage people to make sure so that, if an employee goes and breaks one of the policies and you're like, but you read it, you signed it, and they're like, well, I didn't know. Right. So there is some onus on the employee or on the employer to make sure that they are tuning into all of their employees, learning, the ways that they learn, the way they absorb information. So yeah, my answer is both technical and readability. You want.
You talk about keeping it up to date. How often should an employer be looking at their employee manual?
at least once a year. And listen, when I worked in corporate, it was one of the things I loathed the most. Like reviewing, I thought, oh my God, I have to review this annually. Like, no, it's too boring. However, it's now that I'm on kind of this side, seeing it's so important that you review it annually. Plus, legislation changes often. So it's not good enough just to say, okay, the legislation as of March 31st is changing in this work health place, safety area, and we'll just change it when we review it our annual next January. Well, you can't do that, right? It does have to be a living document. If the legislation's changing today, then you need to update it. So at least annually. Some may say every 2 years, but I think things are changing so often that it's got to be on the radar more often than every 2 years at least.
So manuals aren't going to cover every situation. So how do you resolve conflict or issues that arise from interpretation of the manual or something just not being in it?
Yeah, no, it's another awesome question. Number one, it's important to, be honest. Look, if something comes up that the company didn't think of and doesn't have a policy on, then, stop, let the employee know. Like, you don't have to have the answer right away. This is something I think we learn over time, right? You don't need to have the answer on the spot, even if you're the expert or you're supposed to be the expert in that area. It's like, oh, that's a great question. We don't really know how to handle that. This is the first time we've, leave it with us. We need to consult with, either some peers, colleagues, or some experts in the areas. And as far as resolving conflict, if there's a discrepancy or if there's a misinterpretation or, if people aren't, if two people interpret it differently, I think that shows that there's room for improvement. If two people read it differently, then there needs to be some clarification. So that's an opportunity to say, okay, we need to update this in our policy manual to make it a little more clear. And situations change too, right? You can't think of everything, and that's why it's good to review it as often as possible. But so as new situations arise, you might be like, oh, this, we never had to deal with that before. Let's make sure we add that to the manual so that if it does happen again, we know how to address it. At the end of the day, any of the documents an employee is signing off, it always should have something in there to the effect that, policies may be changed from time to time at the employer's discretion. And even having a line in there to say that, if a discrepancy arises, then, the employer exercises the right to make the final decision or something to that effect.
For sure. Okay. So final question here. If someone wants to write their own employee manual, what kind of advice would you give them?
You can Google it, right? Google it. Lots of organizations share their employee manuals online. They're all over the place. If this isn't your area of expertise, then you may not know what's a good manual or what's a bad manual. So, but as a starting point, it's there. I strongly encourage people to build a network, whether it's within your industry or if you are an HR person, build a network of HR people. I say this all the time. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. Somebody else has a policy manual that I'm sure they'd be willing to share. And if you create this network of colleagues, peers, there's lots of information that you can share back and forth. So, reach out to people, create that larger network. There are companies that, will sell documents, and some of them are awesome. Don't have an HR background, then, some of them cover all the legislation for your area. I highly recommend them. So there's lots of different areas that you can go to find this information. It's not secretive, but definitely finding somebody who has, some knowledge in the area to at least review it for you once you've created it would be my advice.
All right. Thanks, Bev. To be honest, I found that so valuable. And that is the end of this episode. I did an episode on psychological health and safety, and she touched on that here. And the link is right here. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.